Welcome to Week 2, Political Traditions, American Political Ideology. This week, what we will be looking at is American political thought and theory and what shapes our country in its founding era and in modern times. So, ideology is kind of a tricky subject to start with, but for our purposes, there's a pretty easy way to think about it. You have your values. These are things that are not reasoned through, they're not thought through and deciphered. They're kind of a gut reaction to things, kind of your set of morals, a moral backbone. And your beliefs are your ideas about right and wrong. It's your moral code that you have thought through over time with given evidence. When you add these things together, you start to come up with an ideology, which is a cluster of beliefs around different topics, but set of beliefs that are similar. So instead of just thinking about one thing like welfare or kids that are hungry in the street, you're thinking about the entire set of political problems that surround this. So there are two main questions that political ideology has important for us in terms of our study here. One is the origination of power. Where does power come from in a country? It may sound like a redundant question because we tend to think, well, power comes from the people, and that is our American political thought. But before the Enlightenment, it used to be thought that power came from God and was handed down to one or a handful of people, and that person or group of people who were anointed from some deity or deities were the ones in charge because of this. We no longer think that. At least in America, we tend to think that government is created by an amalgamation of citizen interests, or at least that it should be. And then the second question is the role of government. How much power and what kind of power should the government have? Should they be able to interfere with certain property rights, certain freedoms? And, it sounds, again, difficult to conceptualize this because we think of a lot of freedom, but we don't have absolute freedom in the United States. We don't have the freedom to openly murder somebody or to steal somebody's things. So we have a role for government. We just need to decide where it is. And these are the two main questions we'll grapple with this week. American political ideology has a lot of different languages that it speaks in. We have a lot of biblical ideology, a lot of kind of communal ideology, but the two main ones are classical liberalism and republicanism. And it's very important right off the bat that you think of these very differently than you think of liberalism currently or republicanism currently. This is not liberals as in Democrats and Republicans as in Republicans. This is political thought as it started off. The party names do not mesh well here. Classical liberalism is an idea that society is the product of individuals and that individual liberties and property rights are the highest good, so that government only exists in order to protect individual rights or liberties and to protect personal property rights. And the major philosopher there is John Locke, who we'll talk about in a moment. On the other hand, we have republicanism. And republicanism becomes important because it's what shaped our Constitution. Even though liberalism fueled our revolution, what shaped our Constitution is not classical liberalism, but more of an idea of civic duty. But the way in which people take that varies. So republicanism has at its core some idea that society is the product of people coming together, giving up some freedoms, and getting civil rights in exchange for that. So in ancient times, this was philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. In the Enlightenment, John Locke's counterpart was Rousseau. And in the revolutionary times, Madison, in some respects, would sign on to this. So when we talk about liberalism, who we are referencing is our outside author this week, which is John Locke. And John Locke is very important to American political ideology because, in part, Thomas Jefferson lifted the Declaration of Independence. He plagiarized, which I don't encourage you to do, the Declaration of Independence largely from John Locke. And so the idea of life, liberty, and property, which is what John Locke wrote, and Thomas Jefferson said, let's change that to happiness. That comes directly from John Locke, that government only exists to secure life, liberty, and property. So there are three important things to understand about John Locke. First is that he's considered a social contract theorist. That a social contract theorist is someone that believes that the government needs consent from the governed, that there's a contract in place in order to be legitimate. There's no word of God coming down to anoint one leader or another. The second thing is that Locke stresses the role of property and liberty as the utmost important things to secure for government. So that government is only there to protect property, and it's a necessary evil. He actually does not like government, but he sees a need for it in securing people's property rights. Because what if people have a dispute as to who owns a piece of property or what ownership means? That's a point at which Locke would invite government in to be a neutral arbiter. But government should be limited, and it should only follow the will of the people. Locke's ideas were revolutionary and treasonous at the time. So at the time when Locke is writing, he is writing literally in page 1 of the second treatise of government that it's absurd to think that God handed power to Adam and Adam to his son and so on and so on and so on until you get down to the king. And the reason why that's so treasonous is because kings used to think that. They used to try and trace their lineage back to Adam to show how they had a divine right to rule. So when Locke is saying that doesn't matter, that the earth is given to everybody in common, that's actually grounds for getting executed. So Locke was not exactly welcome in his home country for his entire life. And that this is a pretty revolutionary idea, not just for Locke, but then when it's transferred over to America as well. So when we think of political ideology today, we usually think of it as a spectrum that you have on the left, liberals or Democrats, on the right, conservatives or Republicans, and in the middle, some form of moderate or independent. But this is a really simplistic way of viewing this, and I encourage people to think beyond this because there are quite often times where people that are on the very conservative end of this spectrum have beliefs in common with people who are on the very liberal end of this spectrum. So one other way to think about it is this set of quadrants here. And there are many drawings you can find on the internet that define these things a little bit differently, have a slightly different drawing. But this is a very simple way to think about some of these things. In the upper left-hand corner, you have liberalism. And liberalism, and this is in modern times, not classical liberalism, but modern contemporary liberalism, means that there's no personal intervention in personal or social things, marriage, children, etc., but there is intervention in markets, that markets do not regulate themselves, and therefore some regulation is necessary to protect the greater good. On the other end of that spectrum, you have kind of the opposite. No economic intervention, but personal intervention, and that's conservatism. However, those are not the only two things that are up for grabs. You also have libertarianism, which is on the conservative side for some things, meaning they don't want economic intervention, but they don't also want personal intervention, so that government should stay out of both realms of life. And then finally, populism, which takes many different forms, is an idea that there's intervention necessary in both matters. And populist movements depend on any given point in time. So some early populist movements were actually farmers fighting for more regulations to protect them. But some people have also started to say that some of Donald Trump's followers are raising populist concerns. So lumping immigration in with economic regulation and different kinds of intervention. It doesn't necessarily have to be what we would think of as intervention, but it is a call towards populism. So if we break these down, libertarianism is the belief that government should have as limited of a role as possible, that you have free markets with little or no government regulation. So the fact that we have a company called Uber, and they pretty much in most areas regulate themselves, although they're starting to be regulated a bit more. That is a libertarian idea, that people negotiate between themselves, that there's little regulation from government, and that people can make more money if the need arises. But socially, personally, there should also be no or limited intervention as well. So many libertarians believe in legalizing marijuana and sometimes all illegal drugs as well. So libertarianism is one form of kind of an extreme where you don't want any intervention in either set of principles. Liberalism is where you want some intervention in the marketplace. So you see that the marketplace does not regulate itself without government getting involved. And so things like minimum wage laws are an liberal idea that employers should not be able to pay people, barely anything on the dollar to do work. But socially and personally, that the government has no business regulating morality. So things like legalizing same-sex marriage or recognizing it at a state level. Conservatives are the opposite of liberals. They believe that the free market will and should regulate itself, so that they would rather have a removal of regulations that govern transactions like financial transactions or sales, but more regulation on things like social matters, like not recognizing same-sex marriage, because marriages should only be for procreation. Populism is, again, it varies depending on the movement, but it usually happens in response to a societal cause of action from a specific group of people who feels left out in some way. So that economically there needs to be some intervention because otherwise free markets will trample on the rights of people, and that socially or personally individual liberties and rights need to be vigorously protected by the government because they are somehow being trampled on now. So what I want you to do, and this is one of the required blog posts, is go to this link. It is the Pew Political Typology quiz. So let me take us there right now. And what it shows you is where you fit. It'll give you some options. You can begin the quiz. I'm just going to do things at random here. And you pick which one comes closest. See, there are two statements that are the opposite of one another on a similar topic. And some of these may seem like repeat, but there's a reason for that, and that's they're testing how far your beliefs go in a certain area. So if you pick, again, I'm going to do this very quickly as we're talking. If you pick one for each set, and there are 23 sets, it will give you at the end a finding based on your answers as to what your political ideology or typology, they're calling here, is. And with that information, I want you to give some serious thought as to whether they got it right, and definitely take more time than I'm taking right now, but look at some of the questions. Do you agree with the way that they're phrasing their questions? Were some of them a close call? So they will show you on this spectrum here. They will show you how you were likely to vote in 2012, how you are likely to feel on certain issues, and why you generally fit with that typology, and what people with the same typology are like. So you can read the full report if you want, but just remember this. You might want to take a screenshot of it in case you forget it. If you try and print it, it just doesn't come out right for some reason. But you're going to want to think about these things, keep the questions close at hand, and write your blog post about that. So I will be looking forward to reading your blog posts, and have a great week.